Do these bottles look the same to you? Hello all, and welcome back to Lily Bees. I know I said on last week's episode that I was very excited for this week's episode, and I am. I've got that recorded, but not edited yet, so I wanted to put something out that I had completely flown by in talking about bourbon hunting, when really this should have been maybe part 1 or 2. I'm just going to throw it in now because I feel like it's a good precursor to what's to come on the next video. And so I'll be releasing this as sort of a part 1, and part 2 will be what I was mostly excited about. So make sure to stay tuned for that. But what I wanted to talk about on this video is sort of another step of while you're out looking for what you've identified that you think you want, or that you've heard is good, or that others are hunting and you'd like to get one yourself, is how can you tell the difference between looking at one selection versus another, and what makes the difference between them, and why is one so much more valuable or sought after than the other. So I've laid out 3 different Jack Daniel's bottles, as you can see here, and the reason I did this is these fall into 3 different categories as far as when they're released, which makes them more or less rare, if they're available year-round, if they're available in different areas, and what they're worth. So we'll start right here with this Jack Daniel's Single Barrel Select. This is a year-round, widely available product. This is actually available at Walmart, for me locally, year-round. And so what I would call this is sort of the bottom of these 3 tiers as far as rarity, how hard it is to find, etc. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the worst tasting or anything of that manner. You've probably heard there's no such thing as a bad bourbon, it just has to do with what you prefer. And so we're not going to call that a bad one, but for the purposes of today's video, this falls on tier 1 as far as that goes. This is about a $45 or $50 bottle, and if you use a resource that I like to use by Bourboneur, BORBONEUR.com, they have a resource called Bourbon Blue Book, and you can look up specific bottles and see what their average high and low resale value is. And a lot of times you'll either not see a result because something is so widely available that it doesn't even show up on the website, or you'll see that all 3 numbers are the same. Average, high, and low are all $50 on this bottle, and that's what it's worth, and that's what you're going to find it for. So that's another way to kind of help determine rarity of something, and I use that term to cover if it's not released very often, if it's hard to find, if it's unavailable in certain areas, that makes it more rare. And so this is not one of those bottles. Next on the list would be in an identical bottle or identical package, but with different labeling, and you've got to read carefully because Jack Daniel's puts a lot of different things on the label that make a big difference. This is a gold label versus the black. It's also a single barrel product, but this is the single barrel proof bourbon. And this is on our tier number 2 of these 3 bottles. This bottle for me is one that I've seen maybe 2 or 3 of, or not even. I think this is the only one I've ever seen in the state, and my brother saw maybe 1 or 2 in the many places that we've visited. So this is something that is much harder to find, and I would consider this more of an area or a region related thing that makes it more rare. It's not released at certain times like our next product, but it's something that's released in much smaller quantities to specific areas. And so this wouldn't be something that all Walmarts are ordering automatically. This is something that has to be ordered specifically, and if we were to look at the inventory of what's available, this would be far, far less. So it is slightly more rare than the Single Barrel Select product. It's also a little bit more expensive at about $65 to $70 per bottle. And if we were to look up on the Bourbon Blue Book what the resale is of this product, it's going to be not the same three numbers across. And I'll put that up on screen if possible now, what this bottle is worth as a way to set it apart from this one as far as rarity and whether this is one that you want to hunt or not. Finally on the list, in yet another identical bottle, we have the Jack Daniel's Twice Barreled 2022 Special Release. This is one that is on the highest tier of these three that I have shown, and there are other bottles in this series that I'll mention at the end of the video, worth noting. But this one is on the highest tier because this is specifically a year release. So it's by the year 2022. There was one in 21 and 20. There will be one next year, hopefully. And this was specifically a single malt that they released for the first time. You've maybe heard mixed reviews on it. This is one that was released in very small quantities, and this would be something that you sort of had to know about as a store owner to specifically try and order this, and if you got lucky, you got it, and if you got more lucky, you were able to find it as a consumer. So this is on our top tier. Surprisingly, it's got quite a gap or quite a range in value. This is only about a $70 to $75 retail bottle, so we're only $5 to $10 more than our last bottle. But this one is worth somewhere in the range of $250 to $350 if you were to look on the Bourbon Blue Book. And so that really helps you determine the value, and I use that term loosely. It's only worth what somebody would be interested in paying for it on the secondary market. But that helps you determine that this was a very rare bottle because it's worth so much more on the secondary. There's those that are willing to pay that because they know that they can't go to Walmart and find it year-round, such as this bottle. So that pretty well covers what the difference is in these three. Ways that you can know ahead of time what to seek out, and I had some recommendations there. One would be, what I've done is found a couple of YouTube channels that I like to watch, or Bourbon Tube, if you will. And I found a couple there where they make a suggestion. Maybe somebody says, I really like Maker's 46. I like the caramel and vanilla notes and things like that. So you go out, you spend $40 on a bottle of Maker's 46, and you also really like it. So now you take that person's next suggestion and you try that. And the majority of the time you like what they're suggesting. And so you can trust them as a resource because they have a similar palate and similar tasting interests that you do. So that's one way to know what you should be hunting. As I mentioned on the last video, you might also hunt something that you already know that you like, but it's not necessarily available in your area or all the time. So if you're traveling, you would look specifically for that. Another way is just to use the Bourbon Blue Book. If you saw that Jack Daniel's was doing a special release this year, and you typically like their special releases, then you can specifically hunt that. And you can also use that as a way to know, if you search the MSRP of a bottle, you can use that as a way to know how much you should expect to pay. And that's a really good tool to use heading into a store, making sure that you're not going to overpay for a bottle and that you know how much that bottle should cost before you risk paying too much and realizing after the fact. So as I said I was going to mention at the end of the video is actually two warnings. I'm going to lump these together. As I said, there are multiple bottles in this style for Jack Daniel's in particular, and this is true of many different brands. You'll see the single barrel select, the single barrel barrel proof, the single barrel barrel proof rye, and then you have all the store picks of those, and there's just all sorts of varieties. There's the Coy Hill release and all sorts of stuff. And the first warning that I wanted to mention is not to get carried away with trying to complete a collection of one particular bottle just because. That can be a trap where you end up buying something that you don't really know much about, and it's not going to be the same as this. For example, this is a single malt next to a single barrel bourbon, which is going to be completely different, next to a barrel proof, which I have heard, I haven't opened yet, but I've heard has banana notes, and I know I'm not going to find that in this bottle, but because it's the same one, maybe I risked buying it and I'm going to regret that. So that's one thing not to get trapped into. The second thing is, as I mentioned on our, I believe, first video, or maybe it was last week's, is the seasonal sort of bottles that everybody's hunting. So I think last time I said it was Henry McKenna and Early Times and Buffalo Trace and things like that. That's another thing not to risk getting trapped into, is to just buy things because everybody wants them, and so now you feel like you have to get that too. It's a good idea to read the reviews, and as I said, find somebody else who is reviewing these things that you trust their opinion as far as what they prefer before you go and buy it, and now you're stuck with a bottle that you don't like. Because it's hard to sell or trade or whatever open bottles for obvious reasons. So anyway, thanks a lot for tuning in, and I look forward to part 2 of this series where we're going to go bourbon hunting out of state, and I can't wait to bring you along. I'll see you on the next video.